Hello, everyone. So welcome today to our series on the personality of God and SDA Pillar Doctrine. I'm Ed Zabrowski, and I'll be your host through these meetings. And by the way, there's a time limit on the meetings. They're only 35 minutes, so we're going to want to move pretty quickly right into the presentation. To keep things focused, we won't be opening up live audio or video discussions. But there will be a question and answer at the end. So if you have questions, please write them in the chat. Either put them to the presenter or globally to everyone. And the presenter is going to go ahead and answer those questions at the end. So there will be a question and answer after the presentation. And speaking of the presenter, that's going to be Teresa Wilde, and she's going to be speaking on Omnipresence and the Angels. Give me 1 minute as I set up my screen to be shared with you. And also after the presentation ends, hang on, don't go away, because there will be that question and answer, and it will take me, 30 seconds or so to get the screen sharing off and get the audio set up for us. So thank you very much.
Hi, so we're ready to get started into our second meeting, going through the series on the personality of God. Now, last night, Trent explained two main things. He explained that there was a major doctrine in early Seventh-day Adventism called the personality of God. And the other thing he explained is what the doctrine taught. That is, that God is a material person, a physical body, whose shape is like that of humans. Now, that's radically different, as I'm sure you all know, from the common conception of God. And it raises natural and expected questions. There's implications of that portrayal of God, such as, what about omnipresence? If God is a material person, then how do you explain God's omnipresence? And the early SDAs met these types of objections. So let's spend some time tonight going through their statements to see, well, what did they have to say when people objected to the doctrine of God being a material person? What did they say in response to that? And what does it have to do with angels? We're going to see. But before we get into their statements, let's always take a moment before getting into any kind of learning situation to have in mind really good principles, such as being sympathetic listeners, just seeking to understand what the early SDAs taught and what some of their reasons were. Now, I don't have time to go through all of their reasons, but their reasons are explained in their fuller writings. So you'll be able to check those out online. But we will touch on some of their reasons tonight. But the main thing to start off with is, hey, no matter how attached you might be to your current view about God, tonight, let's just hear what the early SDAs taught and see what they have to say. We will never lose anything by that type of listening, by that type of an investigation. It's always a good principle to have in mind. So tonight, we are going to see what the early SDAs taught regarding God's omnipresence. We're going to see that they taught God is not personally omnipresent, but God is in heaven, and that heaven is a real place, not a non-physical realm or a spiritual, otherworldly type idea. They also taught that God is omnipresent by means of his knowledge and by his representatives. So they have really clear statements explaining these views. Here's a couple. One is there at the top, R.F. Cottrell, and he says, infidelity in these last days, instead of denying the existence of God, now everything is God. Or there is a certain something or nothing called immateriality, which pervades every part of the universe, and this is their God, everywhere in general and nowhere in particular. Notice, this is the standard view of an omnipresent God, everywhere in general and nowhere in particular. R.F. Cottrell then says that is a thing of naught, non-entity. It amounts to the doctrine of no God. Well, that's pretty clear. He certainly didn't believe that God is personally everywhere present and nowhere in particular. He says that would amount to the doctrine of no God. Now, G.I. Butler, in a letter to Ellen White, says, neither do I believe in a deity that is everywhere in general and nowhere in particular, floating around through space, dwelling personally and actively in every man, good, bad, and indifferent. So there we have him explaining that, hey, this typical view of God being literally and personally omnipresent, he doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe in a God that is everywhere in general and nowhere in particular, or that is personally, actively in every man, good, bad, and indifferent. So again, very different from what you might be used to thinking of. Now, this is an early statement by John Harvey Kellogg, 1879. He was still very young, and as you can see, he was teaching in harmony with all the other early SDAs. He says, we believe in the God of the Bible, the God whose back parts Moses saw, of whom Christ was the express personal image, who has a definite, tangible form, who is the ruler of the universe and has a definite, actual throne at his seat of government. Now notice he says that a God who is everywhere and nowhere in particular, he says that would be, in fact, nothing better than an idea, a metaphysical abstraction. So in 1879, Kellogg did not believe in a personally everywhere present God. He says God has a definite, tangible form. He has an actual throne, and that a God who's everywhere and nowhere in particular is, in fact, nothing better than an idea, a metaphysical abstraction. Now, the next few slides, I think it's 3 slides, they all have quotes taken from articles explaining the SDA doctrine of the personality of God, and then the authors address objections that people had to the view that God is a material person. Now, the objection, of course, is that, hey, God is omnipresent. So they're answering that objection. So keep that in mind as we read these next statements on these next 3 slides. J.N. Loughborough answers the objection by saying, well, he repeats the objection. He says, but, says one, does not the Bible represent God as everywhere present? So that's referring to Psalm 139. Then he answers the objection and he says, we reply, the subject is introduced in verse 7 as follows. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? The Spirit is God's representative. His power is manifested wherever he wants through the agency of his Spirit. Okay, so not personally everywhere present. God is using a representative. Now, Uriah Smith, also in answering the objection, it is urged that God is omnipresent. And how can this be if he is a person? Answer, he has a representative. So here again, Uriah Smith did not believe God is personally everywhere present, but that God is using a representative. D.M. Canwright quotes Psalm 139, verses 1 to 12. And again, remember, this is after explaining the doctrine of the personality of God. He says, how beautifully the psalmist expresses the thought that God sees and knows all his ways, understands every word he speaks. And then in answer to the objection that God is omnipresent, how can this be if God is a person? He says, in this sense and this only is God everywhere present. So notice he's referring to Psalm 139, and he's saying that this describes God's presence as being through knowledge. He sees and he knows. In this and this sense only is God everywhere present. A.C. Bordeaux says very much the same thing. He says the Bible certainly represents God as located in heaven, for he hath looked down from the height of his sanctuary, etc. Christ taught his disciples to pray, our Father which art in heaven. God is represented to be everywhere, 1, by virtue of his omniscience, and 2, by virtue of his Spirit, which is his representative and is manifested wherever he pleases. But personally, God is in heaven. Okay, again, very clearly, they taught that God is not personally everywhere present, but that he is in heaven. And he uses means of agents or representatives to be present. Now, he also says that at a French Baptist institute, he was taught that God is an infinite and eternal spirit without person, body, shape, or parts, is everywhere and nowhere present. So that's the whole idea of literal personal omnipresence, everywhere and nowhere present, or is everywhere as a spirit and nowhere as a tangible being. Then notice he says, I ask, is not this making God almost a mere nothing? Now, just to point forward to tomorrow night's meeting, you're going to hear more about that type of terminology in Melissa's presentation on the materialist foundation. But we'll move on here. Now, this next slide is very interesting because it represents the fundamental principles taught and practiced by the Seventh-day Adventists. This is printed in 1872. And again, taught and practiced by the Seventh-day Adventists. And in the other side of the slide there, it says that this is a brief statement of what is and has been with great unanimity held by them, held by the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, that shouldn't be overlooked. It is and has been with great unanimity. Now, that word means unanimously, with great unanimity held by Seventh-day Adventists. This is printed in 1872. And notice that it's saying that there is one God, a personal spiritual being, the creator of all things, etc. And then it explains the means by which Seventh-day Adventists taught that God is omnipresent. Not personally, notice it's not personally everywhere present, but everywhere present by his representative, the Holy Spirit. Okay. Now, this statement from James White is taken from his article, Personality of God. And as you might expect, it's all about the doctrine that God is a material person. And he is meeting the objection about, well, what about God's omnipresence? How can he be omnipresent if he's a material person? So the objection is, hey, God is everywhere. He's meeting this objection. God is everywhere. Proof, Psalm 139. He is as much in every place as in any one place. So now James answers that objection and he explains that God is everywhere by virtue of his omniscience. So there's the knowledge aspect, knowledge and understanding. And another means by which he's everywhere present is through his representative. So not personally. Okay. Now, he says God is in heaven, and we're taught this by the Lord's Prayer, our Father which art in heaven. Now, pay close attention to what he's about to lay out here. It's a mode of reasoning that he is sharing. So really consider this. He says, okay, God is in heaven, but if God is as much in every place as he is in any one place, then heaven is also as much in every place as it is in any one place. But if heaven be everywhere and God everywhere, then Christ's ascension up to heaven at the Father's right hand simply means that he evaporated and went everywhere. So that instead of the lovely Jesus so beautifully described in both testaments, we have only a sort of essence dispersed through the entire universe. Notice he says Christ arose from the dead with a physical form. He is not here, said the angel, for he is risen as he said. Taken from Matthew 28. Okay, so very clearly, James White did not believe that God is personally everywhere present. He uses representatives, and he's present through means of knowledge and understanding. So this is the same sort of thing that Ellen White taught. She didn't believe that God was personally everywhere present. Check this out. She says the Lord Jesus came to this world to represent the Father. He did not represent God as an essence pervading nature, but as a personal being. Now, we saw last night they used the word person, person and its variants to mean a physical material body, a physical being. She also says about heaven that it's not a vapor. She says it is a place, and she underlines the word place. She's emphasizing its real material existence. It is not a vapor. It's not everywhere. It's a location. Okay, so here are some other statements regarding heaven being a real place and not some immaterial, otherworldly, outside of the bounds of time and space. A.C. Bordeaux says heaven is not beyond the bounds of time and space, and that God sits on a literal throne in heaven and occupies space. Here again, this is in complete contrast with the idea that God is personally everywhere present. A.T. Jones, also in 1886, he says heaven is a place and not an imaginary, immaterial, intangible nothing beyond the bounds of time and space. So they were all teaching this same thing. They taught that God is not personally omnipresent. They taught that God is in heaven and that heaven is a location. It's a real place. It's not an immaterial, non-physical realm. They taught that God's omnipresence is by means of his knowledge and by his representatives. So what about the angels? Okay, well, let's see. Ellen White links the ministration of angels with the doctrine of the personality of God, and she names them as being two foundation truths. She says extreme views of God in nature undermine the foundation truths of the personality of God and the ministration of angels. So clearly, they had a definite position on both of these subjects because they're two foundation truths. This statement, she says, our Father, who through the ministration of angels, so is ever watching over us. Now notice, what is the means by which God is ever watching over us? It's not by means of being personally omnipresent. It's through the ministration of angels. Now, I should mention that early SDAs also, they believe that angels, and they taught this, that angels are real material beings. They're persons also. They're real material beings, not immaterial spirits and not the spirits of dead people. I won't be able to explain all those reasons why, but just to show what they taught angels in heaven are literal persons possessing body and parts. They have flesh, backs, and hands. They are real, tangible bodies. The angels of God are real, personal, material beings. Angels eat food and are material beings. Now, remember this slide? This was an early statement by John Harvey Kellogg, and he was explaining that, hey, we believe in the God of the Bible, who has a definite tangible form, has a definite actual throne at his seat of government, and he's speaking against the idea that God is everywhere and nowhere in particular. But notice, he says that the God of the Bible with a definite tangible form has angels that he sends out from his seat of government as ministering spirits. Now, this rejects the idea of the literal omnipresence of God, and it instead promotes the ministration of angels as the means by which God ministers to his people. Now, this book, I'll just explain briefly a little bit about this book. It was originally written under the title The Ministration of Angels by D.M. Canwright. And later in 1891, it was revised by J.H. Wagner and reprinted under the name or the title, Angels, Their Nature and Ministry. Now, in this book, Psalm 103 is read and it's pointed to, and then it says, here it is declared. So here in this Psalm 103, it is declared that God hath his throne in the heavens. The angels are represented as waiting before him, ready to go at his pleasure as messengers to all parts of his dominions. So really track with me here. We have a couple more slides. It's going to continue on from this point. So this is describing the means by which God is omnipresent as taught by the early SDAs, and they're pointing to scripture. So angels are ready to go at God's pleasure as messengers to all parts of his dominion. We have here a scene presented similar to that which we would behold in the court of an earthly monarch. The king sits upon his throne with his officers and servants around him. Messengers are constantly being received by him from the different parts of his dominions. When he determines what is needful to be done, he dispatches a trusty messenger to perform it in his name. He also has officers in different parts of his kingdom who faithfully report to him the state of things in their several districts. Thus, the king is able to attend to the wants of his subjects and to oversee their actions in all parts of the dominion, however large it may be. Now, notice what he says. And thus it is that the Lord employs his servants, the angels. He always works by means or agents. The angels are his officers or messengers whom he has appointed to have charge of this earth. They watch over his people and minister to their wants. They bear the prayers of the saints up before the Lord and come again to answer them according to his directions. Now, what is the means by which God watches over his people? What is the means by which God hears and answers our prayers? He's showing that it's by means of the angels. Now, Jacob's dream is also an illustration of this portrayal of how communication is kept up between the heavenly world and the fallen world. Ellen White is writing about this, and she says God was above the ladder. Now, notice what is the means by which God communicates with the fallen world, how she's portraying this here. She says, hear the communication, so the angels ascending and descending the ladder, God's above the ladder, and she says here the communication is kept up between the heavenly world and the fallen world, that man should not be left to the invisible foe. So if not for the ministration of the angels, we would be left to the invisible foe. Now notice, if God were personally omnipresent, the lack of angels wouldn't leave us to the invisible foe. These are very significant points that explain and demonstrate the early SDA's belief and teachings regarding God's omnipresence. It's not a literal personal omnipresence. He uses the means and representatives of angels. Here again, how does Ellen describe God's presence? She says Adam and Eve forgot the presence of God. They forgot that angels surrounded them. So, by means of the angels is God present. She says the presence of God is here. His angels are in the midst of us. So see, she's showing that she doesn't believe that God is personally omnipresent. He's present by means of the angels. Now, this is the last quote we're going to read. So pay really close attention. It's such an amazing quote. And be asking, what is the means by which God is present? So notice, she says the Bible shows us God in his high and holy place. And he's surrounded by thousands and thousands and thousands of holy beings, all waiting to do his will. Through these messengers, he is in active communication with every part of his dominion. By his Spirit, he is everywhere present. Through the agency of his Spirit and his angels, he ministers to the children of men. So again, what is the means by which God is present? Not by being personally everywhere present. No, he's present through means of representatives. These are undeniably clear statements by the early SDAs that what they believed was that God was not personally omnipresent. He uses representatives. He sends them wherever he wants in order to carry out his will in every part of his dominion. Okay, well, that's very clear, right? Their statements are clear, but why does this matter? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons I could give, but I only have time to name one. So imagine that we have two versions of the universe, okay? In one version of the universe, God is personally omnipresent. And in the other version of the universe, God is not personally omnipresent. Now, obviously, these are two completely different types of universes. Now, if God is personally omnipresent, this means God is in everything and everything is in God, including us. Let's not miss this point because most people do think that God is personally omnipresent. So if that's true, this is what it would mean. God would literally be in everything, and everything, including us, would be in God. Whereas if God is not personally omnipresent, it would mean that God is not in everything, and we are not in God. And if God is personally omnipresent, then there's really no escaping the fact that he is personally involved in every action, including every evil. That's an incredibly serious implication. Whereas if God is not personally omnipresent, we act as individuals, not necessarily with God's involvement. We are individuals, God is an individual, angels are individuals. There is this whole society of heavenly individuals. Now, this raises a question. If there are all these other beings in the universe, might there be moral obligations that we have to them? In other words, sharing the universe with a bunch of other beings might carry moral obligations. Now, Trent is writing a book that deals with the moral obligations of coexistence, and you can read it on our website, bdsda.com. It's called, Are You Minding What Matters? Okay, now we have to wrap this up, but for further study on the topic of omnipresence and angels, I'll leave you with this recommended resource. As I mentioned earlier, this was originally written under the title The Administration of Angels by D.M. Canwright and later revised by J.H. Wagner under the title Angels, Their Nature and Ministry. You can see the link there on the screen, and it'll be in the video description once this is published on YouTube. You can also check out our omnipresence tag on our website, bdsda.com/tag/omnipresence. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. Okay, we're ready to transition into the question and answer. And Teresa, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, we actually have some rain here, and so our internet has been a little bit glitchy. So hopefully everything comes through okay. Okay, great. Well, I see that there is one question here, and it's a little bit different. I'm going to go ahead and answer it, even though it's kind of not directly on omnipresence, even though I can see why it was asked. So the question is, it seems in most cases, heaven is usually in the plural, heavens. Did early SDAs have any insights on what would differentiate the multiple heavens? So in a nutshell, I'll say as far as what the early SDAs had to say about that, I just honestly don't know right now how much they really said. I'm not familiar with them saying a whole lot about it one way or the other, but there is something that Trent wrote about that in the most recent blog article and podcast titled God, a Purely Material Person. I believe that's the full title. And I'm going to ask Trent to share the link to that. Oh, I think he did. Yes. So there's the link in the chat. That'll take you to that. And he addresses the idea of the multiple heavens. So, but I will just say that as far as omnipresence goes, let's just say hypothetically, or whatever it means for there to be multiple heavens and for God to be in heaven still would not imply that he's in more than one place at one time, in face of all of the other very plain positive statements by SDAs that they did not believe that God is personally omnipresent, or literally omnipresent, that he has a definite location at any one given point in time, and that he uses means of representatives in order to carry out his will throughout his whole dominion. Yeah. So, but still, very interesting points that are all worthy of contemplation. Now, unless anyone else has a question, I have a few things here that I can think of that often people might ask in regard to omnipresence, but I'm kind of killing a little bit of time here to see if anyone does ask on their own. But I'm not going to wait for too long, just because I know that we don't have a whole lot of time in the meeting. So I will go ahead and pull this up, and I'm going to make that a little bit smaller so that I can still see the chat. Okay. So I actually recently got a question from someone, not in regard to my presentation per se. They hadn't even seen it, it hadn't been publicized until today, but it's a very common question in regard to God's omnipresence. So a lot of people say, well, hey, scriptures say God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So what about that? How can God be a material being if God is a spirit? So I'll share with you a few places that you can go to in early SDA writings to see what they had to say about this. And one thing I'll just say in my own words that I take from what they said, and that I agree with this from my personal studies, is that the term God is a spirit, it actually, if I understand things correctly, in the original text, it just says God is spirit. Okay, but either way, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really change the meaning. It means that God is a living, breathing being of an immortal nature. He's not of a mortal nature. And he's not, okay, so here's the other big aspect of this. God is not an inanimate piece of wood or stone, like an idol for idol worship. He's not that. He's not an immaterial, non-physical entity. The assertion by Christ when he's talking to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well, he's stressing to her that God is a living being, and that those who worship him in spirit and truth, that means we need to live our lives according to truth. That is true worship to God. Now, real quickly, here is a reference. I'm going to see if I can copy and paste this into the chat. This is a link to a section in Ellen White's writings. There we go. I think that's through. Yep. And it has to do with this situation in the scriptures where Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman. And she describes basically what I just said. And so I point you to that. I don't want to spend the time to read it here right now, because I just kind of rephrased it in my own words anyway. But there are a couple other links, if I can find them easily. One of them is to A.T. Jones, an article by A.T. Jones. I don't see it here right away. Maybe that will be included elsewhere in the video description later. But there is another question that is common. I still don't see any new questions. Since we still have time, I'll throw in another one. There's another common question. Well, what does it mean to be a spiritual being? So God is a spirit. God is a spiritual being. Honestly, these are both pretty synonymous terms. And Roswell Cottrell answered that to be a spiritual being means to be a living, breathing being. And he explains that the word Here's what he says. Then as the gift or endowment of life was communicated through the breath of the nostrils, the breath is sometimes called the soul. 1 Kings 17, verses 17 and 21. But breath and life are the leading definitions of spirit. Breath or wind being its literal meaning. And then he goes on. I'm going to share that link as well. Okay. And maybe, I don't see the 10-minute timer yet, so maybe we still have
Actually, the
time for me
10-minute timer did go by. We actually have 2 minutes and 56 seconds till the 40-minute mark. So we're past the 35-minute mark.
Well, for some reason, I didn't see it. I see now. I'm just going to stop there then. And Ed, you can wrap us up. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Teresa. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And just as a reminder, the recording is going to be uploaded to YouTube tonight, hopefully sooner than later, but it does take us about an hour at least to get that done. If you have any further questions or think of some questions later on tonight, go ahead and put those in the comments in YouTube. And if you're watching this for the first time in YouTube, go ahead and put any questions in the comments. And we'd like to invite you back for tomorrow night's meeting, the Materialistic Foundation, same time, same link as tonight's meeting. Have a great evening, and we hope you'll join us again tomorrow. Thanks for coming.